In this video, I'll be demonstrating where I added short rows for the Anker Summer Blouse by Petite knit. That pattern doesn't have any short rows in it, but I chose to add some to raise the back neckline. I've already done a video on adding short rows to a pattern that doesn't have any, and I'll link to that above, but that was more for just a plain circular yoke sweater that didn't have any patterning, or if it did, you added some just right at the back or after some ferrule. Whereas you can see in the Anker Summer Blouse, here for my size, I had 4 sets of ribbing, and for the larger sizes, there's 5. So what I've done is to add short rows directly after each set of ribbing. So if you look at the front, there's each one, there's a section of ribbing, and then there's some increases, because obviously you're increasing as you go down the body. There's a row of increases and then a round of increases and then a round even, then you do another section of ribbing. Then you do a round of increases and then a round even, and then another section of ribbing, and so on. Now I'm going to illustrate with some numbers, but those numbers that I'm going to use are not actual ones in the pattern because I don't want to breach copyright of the pattern. So I'll just be using some made up numbers, but I want to explain where I added the short rows and roughly where you might want to add them, so they're not just in one section, perhaps at the top or at one section at the bottom. You could, I'll show you where they are, where you can see them more clearly on the back. So where I chose to add them, you could choose to add them all here after the first section of ribbing, but then you'd have quite a large section of stockinette. So what I did, you can see that there's a couple more rows or rounds here, well, actually rows because you are turning and going backwards. So there's actually 4 rows here, whereas on the front there's only 2. So I added 1 pair of short rows here, 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 and you can't see it as clearly, but I added another one here because obviously there's another section, there isn't another section of ribbing to make it obvious underneath. But I'll show you on the front, you don't add short rows just on the back, you actually want them to come around because you're actually trying to raise the whole, your shoulders up, and this front sits lower than the back. The short rows actually come all the way around into the front, and then they go a little bit, if I was adding them all here, they would be here, then they'd go a little further back, then they go a little further back, so that they're not, so that they're sort of not going as far around into the body as you add each short row. So in total, I added 8 pairs of short rows, but I added them in between each section, and the first ones came around the most. The second set stopped around, I don't know if you can see here, I'll try and hold it up a little bit closer. The first set, you can see here, it's about, there's 4 here, but only 2 here. The second set came a little bit further back, the next a little bit further back again, and the next were all the way back around here. Now, because there are increases happening, it can be a little bit, normally with short rows, you might say go till 4 stitches before the previous one, or 5 stitches before the previous short row, and it's really obvious where that is because you're doing all the short rows in one place. That can be a little bit trickier once you've added some increases. Well, where would 4 stitches back be? Where exactly in my numbers is this point? Where exactly in my numbers is this point? So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to use some made up numbers and show you where you might, for your sweater, your Anker Summer Blouse, where you might like to add them. So I just wanted to show you where I placed the short rows for my Anker Summer Blouse, and I'm using some made up numbers just so that I'm not breaching copyright of the pattern, but hopefully you'll be able to translate it to whatever your numbers are for your specific size based on me explaining exactly where to place the short rows. So for the pattern, the gauge that I got, which was on gauge, 20 stitches and 28 rows. So for this example, I'm going to say, imagine you cast on 90 stitches, or whatever your size number is. You do the first ribbing section, then you do some increases and you knit around even. Now, if you weren't adding any short rows, you would just start the next round of ribbing. You could, at this point, place all the short rows here after this first increase, which is where I suggest placing them on a just a regular yoked sweater if you don't have any patterning. And then I'll explain to you if I had placed them here where they would go, and then I'll explain to you where that corresponds to for if you don't actually place them all here, if you put them after each rib section. So what I did was I did actually put my first one after the first section of ribbing, then I did my second set of short rows after the second section, third set after the third set, and so on. So you increase out to 135 stitches, knit around even, and then I'm about to start my short rows. So I follow the same rule of third that I talked about before in my last video. 135 divided by 3 is 45 stitches. So I've broken that up into, because that's where I would have got up to after the first increase, and this is where I do my first short row. So starting at the beginning of round, I would knit 45 and then turn, do some kind of short row. I choose German short rows because I think they're quite good in the round. Do a short row, come back around, purl back to the beginning of round, and then purl another 45 stitches over the left shoulder, and then turn, and then knit back to the beginning of round. Now at this point you actually have to start ribbing because you actually begin the ribbing section. So I would then be ribbing around and close those, and so this is ribbing, the whole next section of ribbing for the number of rows of ribbing indicated in the pattern. Now if instead, I'm just going to explain to you where, if I had done all the short rows here and not actually closed them up on this round, where they would have been, because I want to explain to you then where does that correspond to after you've, continuing to do the ribbing, you're increasing down the body. So the numbers won't be the same. So I just want to show you where I would have and what that corresponds to. So in terms of where I placed them, where I would have placed them if I did them here, I had chosen, I would have done the next one 6 stitches back, which would have been at, I'll just put some spokes out here, that would have been at 39. Then I would have done another one, so 6 stitches before the last one. I would have done another one at 33, and then another one at 27. So if I'd done all of the short rows here, I would have gone 45, 45, 39, 39, 33, 33, 27, 27, and then done all the way around. But then I would have ended up with a really large section of stockinette just in one section, instead of, 2 extra rows here, 2 extra rows here, etc. So I just want to explain to you, after you do these increases, because it won't be 39 anymore because you'll have a whole bunch more stitches on the needles. So after the second set of increases, because you do this whole section of ribbing and then you do some more increases, I want to work out where 39 would have been, like what stitch count would that be, given that I've just done a whole bunch of increases. So I do that based on fractions. So I want to go 39 out of, so it's like a ratio, 39 out of 45, and times that by whatever my whatever 45 turned into. So I'll explain for this particular one here. After my second set of increases, I increased to 180 stitches. So I didn't really, but this is the example that I'm using. So in terms of thirds, that 45 would have been 60 and 60. So I have to try to work out 39 over 45 times 60. That will tell me what fraction I have to go to. So for your number, this number here would have been, a third of all your stitches after the first increase, and this number here would be a third of all your stitches after the second increase. And so if I put that into the calculator, 39 divided by 45 times 60 is 52. So where this is after the second set of increases, instead of going to, because that 39th stitch will now be, in terms of position, would now be my 52nd stitch, because I've actually got 180 stitches on the needles. So here's 60. So that sort of, what had been a difference of 6 is now a difference of 8, right? Because we have a whole bunch more stitches on the needles. So my first one would have been at 45. My second one would be, I would knit 52, right? Because it would have been 39 back here, but I've got a whole bunch more stitches. I've increased a bunch. So it'd be knit 52, purl 52, and then 52 back, etc. Then I have to work out this one here, the 33, what would that have become? So for me, so this is after the second increase. For me, after the third increase, I ended up at 225 stitches. You'll have to use your numbers where you are after the third increase. So I would have ended up with 225. So 225 divided by 3. Again, I'm just working out what this number has turned into. The 60th stitch now would be the 75th stitch in terms of, you know, following out the sort of like a radial out from the center. So I have to work out what I would have done at 39 over 45, because that's sort of the fraction of how far I need to go, times it by 75, which is 1/3 of the 225 that I have on the needles, and that works out to be 33 divided by 45 times 75 is 55. So that's where I would go to for my, so I did 45 for my first short row pair, 52, then 55, because that's where the 33rd stitch has ended up after the next set of increases. Now for my size, I didn't do another batch of increases, but perhaps for your size you might, in which case you have to do this math again. But for me, after I did the or the fourth section of ribbing, I didn't have any more increases, so I still had 225 stitches, and then I have to work out what do I want the 27th stitch to be. So that will be 27 on 45, still the same denominator, right? That's the third of the original group. And for me, I'm still going to be timesing by 75 because that 75th stitch is still 75 because I didn't do any more increases. But if you did more increases for your size, you would be using a different number here. So if I work that out, 27 on 45 times 75 is 45. Now, if you don't get a whole number, that's fine, just round up or down. These don't have to be exact numbers. It's not going to make a big difference. So I know it turned out to be the same number here, but this 45 is nothing to do with that 45. This 45 is where the 27th stitch would have been when I've got 225 stitches on the needles. So for me, that's where I did my 8 pairs of short rows. For you, hopefully that's been able to help you. That's if you choose to do the short rows like where I did, one between each section, so it just looks like a tiny bit more stockinette here. You know, 4 rows, and that pretty much looks the same all along the back because it looks like 4, 4, 4, 4. And the last ones just sort of go just into the, you know, just into the sleeves a little bit. Now, and then of course, you do your final pickup, and then in the pattern, I think you do some raglan increases. Now, you could have chosen to do all of the short rows after all of the sets of ribbing, but then you'd have to factor in the fact that you start some raglan increases, and then that gets a little bit more complicated. I will talk a little bit about where to place short rows when you're doing a raglan, because my first video was on just a regular yoked sweater. This one is specifically for the Anker summer blouse, which is yoked, but it has these different sections. If you choose to do it at the very end after the last section of ribbing, it is a little bit complicated by the fact that you've got some raglan increases. I will do another video on that separately, but I actually think it looks quite good to space them out in between the 4 sections. So I hope that's been helpful and you're able to apply this to your numbers for the sweater, and you end up with a back that is, you know, about, for me, this would be about an inch higher than the front, because I've got 8 sets of short rows with a 28 row gauge over 4 inches. That's 7 rows per inch, so 8 rows is just a little bit more than 1 inch where the back is raised from the front, and I find that just makes it a little bit more comfortable around the neck.